Hey guys, it's Bella. Welcome back to my channel. I hope you guys are all having an incredible day today. In today's video, we are going to be covering another solved case. Before we do, I just quickly want to apologize for any construction noise that you might hear in the background. It's happening like literally right there, so you might hear a little bit. Apologies in advance. Today's video is also brought to you by our sponsor Casetify. You may or may not have heard that the new iPhone 14 is out, and Casetify's latest protection technology, EcoShock, is embedded in their iPhone 14 impact cases, which has over 20% increased protection, meaning they provide protection for drops of up to 11.5 feet, which is 5 times the military standard, all while still keeping the phone cases slim and pretty. They still have such a large range of cases, which is still personalizable and are still MagSafe and wireless charging compatible. And the iPhone 14 cases are also made of 65% recycled and plant-based materials, having been partially made from upcycled phone cases as part of their Recasetify program. Whether you are upgrading your iPhone or not, make sure you head to casetify.com for their latest iPhone 14 impact cases, as well as their other cases for iPhone 13s and earlier. And you can also get 15% off your order if you head to casetify.com/Bella. So I will leave all of that information in the description down below. Now, today's case is pretty horrific. Journalists have described it as one of the most brutal methods of murder ever. I think it's a really important case to talk about, and the victim, Kim Wall, was such an inspiring woman. Kim Wall was born on the 23rd of March in 1987 in Trelleborg, Sweden, to parents Ingrid and Joachim Wall. Growing up, her parents described her as alert, curious, happy, and social, and her earliest teachers said she was incredibly creative and inspiring to the other students. Her parents worked as journalists, so her family was constantly traveling, which meant that Kim got to experience a lot of the world as a young child. Kim herself claimed that a lot of her childhood was spent either in newsrooms or traveling, which must have inspired her in some way, because she would go on to become a freelance journalist herself who had her work published by outlets including the New York Times, The Guardian, and Vice. She graduated from the London School of Economics and Political Science with a bachelor's degree in international relations, and she would go on to continue her studies at Columbia University, where she would receive a master's in both journalism and international affairs. Her friends said that she had a lot of natural skepticism and tenacity, which made journalism a natural fit for her, and she wasn't afraid of putting herself in a dangerous situation in order to tell a valuable story, which led to her reporting from many parts of the world, including North Korea and post-war Sri Lanka. Kim loved to tell stories from the fringes of society, covering social issues, foreign policy, and stories of eccentric people doing crazy things, often touching on issues of equality. And this is what led her to pursue Danish inventor and micro-celebrity Peter Madsen. Peter was born in 1971 and grew up in Denmark in the small town of Sæby before later moving to the town of Hong. In primary school, he became interested in rocket fuel, and he would go on to launch his first large rocket in 1986, which only reached 100 meters before crashing somewhat safely, which led him to be nicknamed Rocket Madsen. Because of this, he definitely fit into Wall's criteria of an interview candidate. He was an ambitious geek with an interest for creating self-described extreme machines, and he wanted to make Denmark a rocket-producing nation. It was his life goal, and nothing would stand in his way. If you couldn't help him complete his mission, you were pretty much invisible to him. Peter did have a pretty difficult upbringing. His father, Carl, was not a great guy. He worked in Nazi Germany. He also physically abused Peter and his siblings, and he married a much younger woman named Annie. Eventually they did separate, and Peter decided to stay with his father Carl and never speak to his mother again. Peter's biographer, Thomas Jersing, who had a very strong relationship with Peter and was considered a close friend, actually said that Peter had a very strong hatred for women, and he believes it stemmed from that situation. Before we get into what happened, I think part of what makes this case so shocking is the geography of it. Kim was living in a place called Refshaløen in Copenhagen with her boyfriend Ole, and this is also where Peter's workshop was located. And Denmark, Sweden, Scandinavia in general are typically considered to be very safe places, with Denmark in particular ranking 4th on the World Global Peace Index. So it's not hard to understand why Kim was so trusting of Peter. She was a stone's throw away from her home. Peter was, there was nothing wrong with him. He had no no criminal record. He was considered to be somewhat of a micro celebrity in the area as well. Some people even compared him to Elon Musk, which personally I think is a bit of a stretch, but you know, just for context. Now, at the time this case took place in 2017, Peter's focus wasn't actually on his rockets. It was on his third homemade submarine, which he had named UC-3 Nautilus. And Kim wasn't as interested in the submarine as she was his rocket projects, but she had been trying to land an interview with him for months, and she knew that she could still tell an interesting story about the submarine. So on the 10th of August in 2017, Kim and her boyfriend Ole were actually going to be having like a going away party because they were going to be moving to China pretty soon for an exciting job opportunity. But the afternoon the party was meant to be held, Kim received an unexpected text from Peter which basically said that she could go and interview him aboard his new submarine. And so she actually made the decision to skip her own party and to go and take this opportunity to interview him on his submarine, which just emphasizes how passionate she is about her work. So Kim walks a short distance to Peter's workshop to, I guess, like get sort of a pre-interview sort of thing, and then she goes back to Ole, her boyfriend, to just let him know that she managed to secure an interview with Peter and that she was going to be going out on the submarine with him later that evening, but she'd only be gone a few hours and she was expecting to make it back by the end of the party. Peter had actually invited about 3 or 4 other women to interview him on the submarine, but Kim was the first to say yes, and that evening she left her own party early and went and boarded his submarine at 7 p.m. As they began their voyage, Kim sent a few texts to her boyfriend Ole saying, "I'm still alive by the way, but I'm going down now. I love you," with like a bunch of exclamation marks, and he brought coffee and cookies though. And these would be the last messages that Kim would ever send. There were also photos of Kim and Peter traveling out on the submarine about 90 minutes after they boarded, and it's really eerie because these are the last ever photos of Kim and she looks so calm, she's smiling. Between 7 and 10 p.m, Kim's boyfriend Ole sent her multiple texts and never heard back from her, and it was quite worrying because she was only meant to be out on the submarine for a few hours. She was meant to make it back in time to get to the end of her own party, but by 10 p.m, when he still hadn't heard from her, Ole did become quite concerned. At around midnight, the submarine was spotted on the northwest end of the Orison Bridge, but unfortunately it didn't have any satellite tracking and no one was able to get in contact with Peter either. A few hours later at 2:30 a.m, Ole contacted the Coast Guard to let him know of his concerns, and it was at around that time that both Kim and Peter were reported missing. Around an hour later, the Danish police started their search for the submarine and sent out an alert that there may have been an accident at sea. It wasn't until 10:30 a.m. that the submarine was finally spotted on Koge Bay from a nearby lighthouse, and a rescue chopper was immediately called in. The chopper found Peter standing on top of the submarine, and so he at this point made contact via radio and said that everyone aboard the submarine was fine. Shortly after that, the rescue chopper made the alert that the submarine was actually now sinking and that a person had jumped into the water and had been rescued by a boat of fishermen and taken to the port of Dragor. This person turned out to be Peter, and so when he was taken to the port, he was met with media and police, and allegedly at this point he told a journalist that the reason the submarine had sank was because there was like a valve failure in the ballast tank and that he was the only one on board when this accident happened. He said that he had dropped Kim off at the point of Rochelle Island at 10:30 p.m, but this was actually later disproven because a restaurant owner from the precinct Kim was dropped off at provided police with extensive CCTV footage which showed that Kim was never there. She was never dropped off. Now by this point, people were thinking that something had happened to Kim after she got off the submarine, but as the day went on, people's opinions started to change and suspicions began to arise among investigators and people who knew Kim. Lieutenant Commander Ditty Diaborg was a commander from the Danish Navy who had been called in to assist as the submarine chief engineering officer on the day the submarine went missing. And they said that they were immediately suspicious when the submarine sunk and said, quote, "A submarine doesn't sink like that. He could have saved it." They suggested that police arrest Madsen so that they could get to the bottom of it immediately. Peter was also acting kind of odd as well. He was looking tired, he was run down, and just kind of like he was hiding something. Peter's biographer Thomas Jersing said that post-rescue, Peter just was not acting like he normally would. He wasn't saying the things that he normally would be saying in this kind of scenario. He said, quote, "I would imagine Peter saying, 'I'm so sad the crown jewel of my work has now gone down to the bottom of the sea, but this is the real way it should be done, with glory.' And he would use those big words. He would be a poet." Now, obviously, Kim is still missing at this point, and there's a huge search underway. The Swedish police have become involved, and they're trying to locate Kim's phone. The Danish Navy have also become involved, and they're trying to look through the water to locate the submarine because they're suspecting that Kim potentially may have been aboard the submarine when it sank. So they went down, they located the submarine, and they had a look around with GoPros. They looked in the windows and they were able to conclude that there were no survivors on board. However, they weren't actually able to enter the submarine due to its position on the seafloor. Now, while all of this was going on and the searches were underway on the 11th of August, at 5:44 p.m. that day, Peter Madsen was actually arrested on preliminary manslaughter charges. And preliminary charges are basically like a step before being formally charged. So he'll go and have a hearing and the judge will decide if there's enough evidence to actually then charge him with manslaughter. After he was detained, they went and did a forensic examination to secure some DNA. And then the following day, on the 12th of August, they had the preliminary hearing. And at this hearing, Peter actually admitted that Kim did in fact die on board the submarine, but it was some kind of like freak accident to do with like the hatch. So following this admission, they decided to hold Peter while they could figure out how that possibly could have happened. And you know, there's still no body at this point, so it's looking a little weird, like, oh, she accidentally died on the submarine. Well, then where is she? So they also decided to charge him with negligent manslaughter, but none of this information was released to the public until the 21st of August. By this point, Kim has been missing for 48 hours, and investigators have a huge body of water to look through with little to no evidence or help from Peter, so they really have their work cut out for them with this search. They started off by lifting the submarine out of the water, draining about 9,000 gallons of water out of it, and confirmed that Kim's body was not inside the submarine. Lieutenant Commander Ditty Diaborg was one of the first people who boarded the submarine after it was drained, and they described it as being a complete mess, claiming they saw what looked like flesh on board. They also noticed a wet patch on their clothing afterward, which they said smelled like the metallic fragrance of blood. Some of Kim's belongings were also found on the submarine, like her jacket. Later that day, the police held a press conference where the chief of police said that it was clear and that there was evidence that the submarine had been sunk intentionally, which definitely went against Peter's initial story that there was something wrong with the valve in the ballast tank that caused the submarine to sink on accident. Days went by with no success in locating Kim or any evidence as to what may have happened to her, and even though Peter was still being detained, he was not helping police at all or giving them anything that may help them find Kim. However, on the 16th of August, his charges were actually upgraded to causing the death of another person under particularly aggravating circumstances. Now, a few days later, if you remember how Peter, when the submarine was sinking, he jumped off into the water and he was rescued by a boat of fishermen. Well, one of those fishermen actually came forward to say that when they rescued him, Peter was like, hold on a minute, I just have to go and fix something on the submarine quickly before it sinks. At around the same time, Kim's family also launched an appeal, and they stated, quote, Kim has worked in many dangerous places in her work as a journalist, and there have been many times where we have been worried about her. We are experiencing the worst days of our lives. By the 21st of August, Kim has been missing for 11 days at this point, and it's at this time that the police decide to release their reasoning behind Peter being detained on negligent manslaughter charges, and they also released the fact that during his hearing, he said that Kim had died on board the submarine in a freak accident where she was knocked dead by the 70-kilo hatch. Peter claimed that he was so traumatized by this experience that he panicked and decided to hold an immediate funeral for Kim and dumped her body in the ocean. And this was all published in a press release, but I believe Kim's family already knew about this and that they had known about this since the detention hearing. I mean, this whole story about the hatch is just unbelievable to me because it makes no sense. First of all, at no point during their time on the submarine were they more than 30 minutes away from land, and he could have called somebody. Like, I don't understand why he would feel the need to bury her at sea first of all, unless he had something to hide, especially before calling anybody, getting advice, calling paramedics to meet him at land. It makes no sense. Anyway, the same afternoon that this information was released, the 21st of August, a press conference was held that afternoon, and they released the fact that they had actually found the torso of a woman which had washed up on the shoreline of Amager. Reports showed that somebody had inflicted the torso with wounds to prevent it from floating, and they had also strapped pieces of metal to the torso. And while they still had to do DNA testing to figure out who the torso belonged to, it's not every day that a torso washes up on the shoreline, and so conclusions were made. 2 days later, on the 23rd of August, forensic analysis came back and confirmed that the torso did belong to Kim Val, although it couldn't determine a cause of death. But because of this, it was pretty clear that this wasn't an accident, although Peter was still claiming it was. He was claiming he didn't murder her and that he didn't dismember the body, but 2 days later he was charged with the indecent handling of a corpse. After Kim's torso was found, the search continued for the rest of her body, and specially trained Swedish dogs called HRD dogs were even brought in, which are used to hunt smells at the bottom of the ocean. So it's a massive search effort at this point. They've got these dogs, they've got the Danish police, the Swedish police, and the Danish Navy all searching for the rest of Kim's body. By the 5th of September, there was a pre-trial hearing that spanned more than 3 hours, and at Peter's request, this was an open courtroom, so there was media everywhere, and Peter spoke at this hearing and gave more details on this supposed freak accident story that he was still going with. He basically claimed that he opened the submarine hatch for Kim while she was climbing out of the submarine, and he lost his grip, causing it to fall out of his hand, and it then fell on Kim's head, which caused her death. He said, I quote, "It was a terrible accident, a disaster. No doctor could have done anything. Kim was severely injured. There was a pool of blood where she landed. I touched her neck, but she had no pulse." During this hearing, it also came out that Peter may have been interested in violent pornography, and so they wanted to gain access to his computer, but Peter did not want to give them access because he claimed that his computer had business secrets on it. They also wanted him to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, which again, Peter really didn't want to happen. But in the end, the judge ordered that he had to hand over his computer and that he did have to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. Now, obviously, none of his story explained why Kim had been dismembered, and so he was still ordered to be detained and held for another 4 weeks while they tried to figure that out. On the 5th of October, over a month and a half after Kim went out on that submarine with Peter and disappeared, they still hadn't found the rest of her body. So they hired an oceanographer to help approximate the best places that they could find her body, like where the submarine had been, where her torso washed up, that sort of thing. And by the next day, the 6th of October, after 56 days of 50 divers searching 200 acres, they finally had a major breakthrough when deep on the ocean floor, they found multiple plastic bags which contained the rest of Kim's body. Inside those plastic bags were Kim's head, legs, clothes, and a knife. This information was released to the public the very next day on the 7th of October, and it was also revealed that there were no fractures to her skull. There was no signs of any blunt force trauma to her head, which disproves Peter's entire story about this accidental death with the hatch. So following this discovery, Peter comes up with a new explanation. So he's now claiming that at some point he was outside on the deck of the submarine when all of a sudden the air pressure in the submarine dropped, and the inside of the submarine, where Kim still was, started to fill with exhaust fumes. And so he runs to the hatch to try and open it to let Kim out, but it's stuck, so he can't get it open. And by the time he finally does, Kim has died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, his reasoning for providing a false story to begin with is because he wanted to spare the family of the gruesome details, which makes absolutely no sense because either way, it's just as gruesome. By this point, Peter's still lying. He's still pretending he didn't murder her. He's still pretending he didn't dismember her. And unfortunately, there's no explicit proof at this point that he did murder her. And then on the 11th of October, he also said he was no longer going to cooperate with police and he no longer wanted to participate in the hearing. Now, around this time, there was also a saw with an orange handle that was found in Kogi Bay in the path that the submarine would have taken. And I couldn't find a lot of information on what happened with this saw, if they ever tied it to the murder or anything like that. But allegedly, a film crew was filming Peter and Kim in his workshop 5 hours before they went out on the submarine, and they caught footage of a saw with an orange handle hanging behind Peter in his workshop. By the 30th of October, there was a massive shift in this case because Peter finally admitted to dismembering Kim's body and throwing the parts in the water, and his crime was also upgraded, or the definition of his crime was upgraded, to sexual crimes under particularly aggravating devastating conditions, as they had found a large number of stab wounds in Kim's groin area. Over the coming months, they also managed to find both of Kim's arms, and by the 12th of January, they stopped trying to locate Kim and Peter's phones. On the 16th of January, Peter Madsen was formally charged with the prepared and planned killing of Kim Val. He was also formally charged for indecent handling of a corpse and sexual assault. And before we continue, I just want to emphasize how tragic it is that Kim died in such a horrific way while she was just trying to do her job. And although an extreme case, it really highlights a problem that women face each and every day in both a professional and domestic setting. Peter Madsen's trial began on the 8th of March in Copenhagen City Court, and it was an absolute media circus. There was a lot of attention for this case both locally and globally. The trial was going to take 12 days with approximately 40 witnesses, and Peter was also going to be taking the stand to tell his side of the story. And when he did take the stand, he kind of had the upper hand because he had such a great technical knowledge about submarines that he was able to come up with these complicated explanations that were hard to disprove. And he went into great detail about how Kim died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Regardless of how smooth Peter was, though, his internet search histories did him no favors. He had internet searches before the murder of things like beheading, girl, and agony. It was also found that the pipes and straps that were attached to Kim's body to help it sink instead of float, they also found similar items in Peter's workshop. Peter then tried to flip the narrative and tried to make it one where he did this out of respect to Kim's family. He said, and I quote, "What I will tell you today is a story that I did not want to tell anyone ever." And when asked by the prosecutor about the dismemberment, he said, "What do you do when you have a big problem? You cut it up into pieces." On the 23rd of March, a number of women were called to the stand to testify, and the goal of this was to analyze Peter's relationships with women. These testimonies brought to light the fact that Peter had dark sexual fantasies and often frequented fetish parties for people who liked BDSM. In text to previous lovers, he described himself as, quote, "a perverted poly with a dream of a taboo-free place where all adults in their right mind can do to each other whatever they want." In the months leading up to Kim's murder, it seems that Peter started to more deeply explore his dark, violent sexual fantasies, and he sent a number of potentially incriminating texts. I'll read you some of the texts now. One said, "I'll tie you up and pierce you with a skewer." Another text read, "Then the hobby knife comes out and I look at your throat. Where is the artery?" Another text read, "You are going to be tied up against the Nautilus," which, if you remember, is the name of his submarine. And another text read, "Since I've gone criminal, I might as well kidnap you as well as your husband and children." To top it all off, they found a bunch of violent, sexually oriented material on his computer, like snuff films. And if you don't know what a snuff film is, it's basically a recording of a real murder, usually of women. A witness, when asked if Peter did enjoy snuff films, said it was more of a fascination. And I don't know if maybe this fascination could have been the motive behind his murder of Kim. During the trial, the prosecution also presented the psychiatric evaluation that was done on Peter, and it showed that he had a severe lack of empathy and sense of guilt. After the trial on the 25th of April, Peter Madsen was found guilty of premeditated murder and was sentenced to life in prison. And this is actually somewhat of a historic moment in Denmark because it's super uncommon in Denmark for a life sentence to be handed down to somebody who has committed a single murder. And this life sentence as well is only 16 years with the possibility of parole after 12, which is just crazy in my opinion, that somebody who has murdered somebody so horrifically and clearly feels no guilt or remorse for it could potentially get parole after just 12 years. Peter's biographer, Thomas Jersing, has since come out to say that in hindsight, Peter was narcissistic and manipulative. He said that people surrounding him allowed him to act in this way because of his visionary ideas. I mean, it's just crazy to me that Peter was able to hide all of these dark desires and dark thoughts from those closest to him. Like, there was an interview with Thomas after all of this came out, and you can tell just how shocking and devastating it was for him to find out that somebody he considered a close friend was somebody he really hardly knew at all. Immediately after Peter was sentenced, he tried to appeal the decision. However, his sentence was upheld. In 2020, after serving just 30 months, Peter actually managed to escape prison on the back of a bomb threat, and he was, found and caught and apprehended again. So hopefully this is not going to do him any favors when it comes to parole. Another part of this case I wanted to briefly touch on is the way the media reported and the criticism the media received for how they reported this case, because they spoke a lot about Peter and his life and the crimes instead of focusing on Kim and what an inspiring and hardworking woman she is. One journalist described some of the media coverage as voyeuristic, and I think that's the perfect way of describing it after seeing some of the archived media outlet articles. Following the case, Kim's family and friends started the Kim Vol Memorial Fund to keep her legacy alive. Funds from this are distributed as a grant by the International Women's Media Fund to support female journalists, so I will leave the link to that down below if you want to check it out and support. But that is everything for today's case. That's all from me. Obviously, this is a really horrific case, and it's just devastating that Kim had to suffer such a devastating and horrific death from such an evil man while she was just trying to do her job. But that's everything, so I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully I will see you in my next video. Bye!